What if everything you thought about the glory of Greece and Rome was wrong? What if debt, not democracy, was their lasting legacy? This isn't just history, it's the blueprint for today's financial collapse. The collapse of antiquity, Greece and Rome as civilization's oligarchic turning point. 1. The historical premise of debt and civilization. The historical and economic analysis interrogates a persistent theme from classical antiquity to modernity: the treatment of debt within the structure of civilization. The argument positions ancient Greece and Rome not as the originators of democratic ideals, but as significant departures from earlier economic balances that prioritized debt forgiveness. In doing so, the mythologized continuity of classical antiquity into modern Western civilization, instead suggesting a historical discontinuity based on financial ethics and institutional power. Footnote: this section frames the fundamental thesis that debt and its management reflect the moral and structural foundation of civilizations. 2. Early Near Eastern practices of debt forgiveness. In contrast to the rigid pro-creditor regimes of Greece and Rome, early Mesopotamian and Near Eastern civilizations, notably Sumer and Babylonia, for their institutionalized debt jubilees. These societies maintained economic equilibrium through periodic cancellation of personal debts, return of land, and emancipation of debt servants. Rooted in sacred kingship and divine law, these practices prioritized societal stability over creditor dominance and formed the foundation of Mosaic law, including the biblical Jubilee in Leviticus. Footnote: the origins of debt cancellation were deeply embedded in sacred law and sovereign responsibility in the Near East. 3. Greece and Rome, the abandonment of economic balance. With the decline of Near Eastern influence, Greece and Rome transitioned into pro-creditor states, eliminating the mechanisms of debt relief. Emerging city-states in Greece, lacking centralized authority, enabled local oligarchies to enforce debt servitude without systemic checks. Rome similarly evolved from agrarian distribution under kings to an increasingly polarized society, dominated by creditor aristocracies. Reformers advocating for land redistribution or debt cancellation were met with state-sanctioned violence and assassination. Footnote: the consolidation of oligarchic power in Greece and Rome was a direct result of abandoning mechanisms of debt relief. 4. The tyrant and the king as democratic forces. The historical concept of the tyrant not as a despot, but as a democratic reformer. In cities such as Corinth and Athens, tyrants like Solon sought to cancel debts and restrain creditor land grabs. Roman kings performed a similar function by ensuring equitable land access and restricting debt bondage. Once overthrown, both systems gave rise to entrenched oligarchies masquerading as republics, where political and financial power remained concentrated in aristocratic hands. Footnote: the term tyrant historically denoted popular reformers who limited creditor dominance and restored civic participation. 5. Debt, military service, and the fall of the Republic. Debt enslavement not only eroded land ownership, but undermined state security. In Greece and Rome, citizens burdened by debt could no longer serve in the military or participate in infrastructure projects, compelling reliance on mercenaries. This economic imbalance contributed directly to the collapse of civic militaries and the emergence of feudal labor models, such as the Roman colonists, the precursor to the medieval serf. Footnote: debt dependency fractured the foundational civic structures of military and public service in ancient states. 6. Christianity's transformation from a debtor religion to an oligarchic tool. The Christian doctrine originally emphasized debt relief as a central theme, mirroring early Judaic traditions and Near Eastern customs. Jesus' teachings advocated Jubilee principles, yet under Constantine and subsequent church fathers like Augustine, the doctrine was reinterpreted. The Roman Church, allied with oligarchic interests, rejected economic justice and emphasized sin, guilt, and obedience. The resulting theology institutionalized support for creditor supremacy and subjugated popular movements. Footnote: Christianity's early per-debtor orientation was reversed by Roman ecclesiastical power to legitimize creditor rule. 7. The medieval church and the legalization of usury. While early church councils prohibited usury, these prohibitions eroded under feudal pressure. By the time of Pope Leo X and the Lateran councils, linguistic shifts redefined usury and permitted compound interest under new legal fictions. The church enabled feudal lords and crusading monarchs to finance wars through high-interest loans, creating a system of debt extraction justified by theological contortion. This evolution directly to the financial structures underpinning modern capitalism. Footnote: canonical bans on usury were undermined by semantic manipulation and political expediency within the church. 8. Historiography and the problem of victors' narratives. A key critique is the historiographical bias of classical sources, particularly figures like Cicero. Often cited as exemplars of Roman virtue, such voices were in fact defenders of oligarchy and staunch opponents of popular reform. Their narratives, amplified by subsequent Western scholarship, created an ideological framework that valorized creditor violence and delegitimized democratic redistribution. Footnote: historical interpretation has been shaped by oligarchic sources that rewrote popular resistance as treason. 9. Lessons from Antiquity for contemporary debt crises. The structural refusal to cancel unsustainable debts, once characteristic of Rome, now defines modern global finance. Institutions insist that all debts must be paid, regardless of social or national consequence. Yet historical alternatives exist, as demonstrated by ancient economic models that placed equilibrium above repayment. The lesson is clear: debt relief is not only possible but necessary to avoid civilizational decline. Footnote: the rigid enforcement of debt without regard for social capacity leads inexorably to oligarchic decay and systemic collapse.